Hi. So, welcome to the today's tutorial session or the help session for the course I Think Biology, which is offered by Azim Premji University on the NPTEL website. And I am Geetika Agarwal. I am a PhD scholar at the Center for Ecological Sciences, and I will be taking this tutorial for you today. So, first of all, I would like to summarize what all was covered during this week, and then we can move on to some questions and answers, which will help you in get an idea of what kind of questions can be asked in the quizzes or in the exams and things like that. And so, solving these questions will help us move forward and understand the topics better. So, the content or the topics that were covered during this week included evolution. So, we talked about evolution and things like what evidence do we have that supports the presence of evolution? What are the mechanisms by which evolution comes about? What are some misconceptions that we might be we might have about evolution, or some misconceptions that we see generally online and things like that, and human evolution, and how homo sapiens as a species have evolved. Okay, so moving on to the first um, lecture. So first of all, let's see how the existence of life was viewed in the history. So in old times, or in like the early 1800s, there were different kinds of views that existed about how life has come about, and one of them was special creation, which which was present or prevalent in the early 1800s, when Europeans, they mostly thought that it is God, it is this supreme power which has created everything, and God created everything just the way that it is right now or today. And according to them, each species, it was created separately and independently of every other species. And earth and life in general were not very old. Like, it was not like billions of years ago that earth came about. They're pretty recent, earth and life both. And the species, they do not undergo changes on their own. That were some of the things, or that the theory of special creation put forward. And the followers of this theory believed that God is someone who has created all of the species just as they are. Then comes around the other theory, which is called descent with modification. According to this theory, people believed that species, they do undergo changes over time. So species, they change over time. New life forms, they do not develop just out of thin air, and they're not created by God, but they develop from existing old life forms. All of these species, they're related to each other in some sense. So all of these species that exist, all of the life forms that exist on the earth, they are related to one another in some sort of a way. And earth and life on earth, they are very old. So it's like, it has been a long time since earth has formed and since life has been existing on earth. So these were the two major views that existed at that time about life and how life has come about. Then came in these two people, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. You might already be aware about Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution. So basically, Charles Darwin, he went around on his ship called HMS Beagle, and he reached the Galapagos Islands, where he studied these special birds. These are called Darwin's finches. He studied these finches on the Galapagos Islands. And from his study, he came to the conclusion of evolution, and he wrote his book, Origin of the Species, and he put forward the theory of evolution. At the same time, his contemporary Alfred Russel Wallace, he was working in the Malayan archipelago, which is somewhere around here, which is in Southeast Asia. In that, and you can see in this green, these are the islands that fall in the archipelago. So he was working in the Malayan archipelago, and he was working with invertebrates. For example, as you can see, these butterflies here as well. Oh, sorry for the internet problem. Yeah, sorry for the disconnection. I seem to have had a internet issue. So what I was saying was that Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace were actually contemporaries. They were working at the same time, and they independently reached the same conclusion. And there was an exchange of letters between these two scientists, between these two ecologists, and they exchanged ideas, and they came to the conclusion that evolution. They came to the conclusion that evolution might be the process, and all these species are linked together by this thing called evolution, and that is how. Um, So that is how all the species are linked together, and diversity of life can be explained actually with the theory of evolution. So in 1859, Charles Darwin actually proposed this theory in his book, The Origin of the Species, or On the Origin of the Species, and Alfred Wallace also independently later on published his work about evolution. So he was working on these invertebrates, and he was also studying mimicry in butterflies. Okay. So, what is evolution and what is natural selection? So, you must have heard these terms, you must have come across these terms of evolution and natural selection. So, what are they? So, evolution actually is a change in heritable characteristics of populations over generations. So, from the definition, you can see we're talking about some change in some heritable characteristics. So, these characteristics or these traits that you're talking about, they should be heritable. And there is a change in these heritable traits in the populations over generations. So, when you move on from one generation to the next, you observe some change in these heritable characteristics, and this phenomena is called evolution. And what is natural selection? Natural selection is actually a process by which organisms that are better adapted to their environment, they are more likely to survive and reproduce and pass on their genes to the next generations as compared to the ones that are less adapted to the environment, that are less fit to survive in that environment, and these ones tend to get eliminated. So this is a brief introduction to evolution and natural selection. So, natural selection is a process. So, if you have organisms, some of them might be better adapted to living in a certain environment, while others might be a little less well adapted. And natural selection will then choose, or because of natural selection, the organisms that are better adapted in the environment, they are more likely to survive, and they are more likely to reproduce. And hence, they will pass on their genes to the next generation. So, this process is called natural selection. Moving on to what are some of the basic requirements in evolution. So, as we already saw in the definition of evolution, you need some heritable traits. So, first of all, for the change to happen, you need a variety of traits. So, in the population, you need to have some variation in that trait. So, if you're talking about, say, evolution of heights, so if all the organisms in the population are roughly the same height, then there not be much variation in that trait. So you require a variation. You need some tall individuals and then some short individuals. So you need that variation for evolution to come about. So there should be a variation in the traits that we're talking about, and these traits that we're talking about should be heritable. For example, I'm talking about height, and we know that height is heritable. Our heights are influenced by what the heights of our parents are. And then there should be some differential reproductive success. So, this, for example, means that there should be some benefit to one of these variety of traits over the other varieties. For example, if shorter people have some benefit over the taller people, for example, say, uh, or take the opposite example. For example, taller people have a benefit over short-heighted individuals. For example, say all the trees are super tall, and to get to the resources in these trees, the individuals need to reach higher up. For example, if you're talking about giraffes, individuals need to reach higher up to reach these tree leaves. Then the giraffes that are slightly taller or which have slightly longer necks will be better adapted in that environment as compared to the shorter ones, and these ones will have a differential reproductive success. They will have better they will leave behind a higher number of progeny. They will have a better success at reproduction, and this differential reproductive success is very important for evolution to come about, because only then will these tall heighted or these longer necked giraffes will move for or will be able to leave behind more progeny, and eventually the shorter heighted ones will get eliminated as the longer ones keep on increasing in number. Right, so that is some basic requirements for evolution with some examples. So to keep in mind, the basic requirements are there need to be traits, and these traits need to have some variety. There needs to be a variation in the traits. These traits should be heritable, they should be passed on from generation to generation, and there should be a differential reproductive success related to this traits. So some of these traits confer some benefits which make the individuals carrying these traits reproductively more successful as compared to the other ones which do not carry these variations. Okay, moving on to what are some evidences that exist that might be that might help us explain evolution, or that might help us say that yes, evolution did happen or evolution exists. So some of these evidences that were talked about during the lecture were directly observing evolution happening, homology or looking at common ancestry, looking at fossil records, or studying biogeography. These are some of the evidences that might explain the presence of evolution. First of all, when we come to talk about direct observation, so what is direct observation? For example, you have bacteria and you are treating it with some drug, some antibiotic drug. So what you might observe is if you plate these bacteria, these bacterial colonies, some of them, most of them might be sensitive, but some of them might just be antibiotic resistant. Some of these strains, they might, because of some random mutations, these might just be antibiotic resistant strains. Now, what will happen is because your petri dish had antibiotic in it, all of the sensitive strain will die out, but the colonies that were antibiotic resistant, they will stay. And now these are the colonies that will start multiplying. So now you see that evolution has happened over populations or over generations. In this population, you see that the strain or the sensitivity strain has actually been eliminated, and the antibiotic resistant bacteria moves on. Another thing you can observe is that these drug resistant bacteria might be able to pass on their drug resistance to another antibiotic, to a group that is not actually, that is actually sensitive, because of horizontal gene transfer. So this is vertical gene transfer happening from parents to offsprings, and if it's happening within the same generation, then that's called as the horizontal gene transfer, which is common in bacteria, which happens by the transfer of plasmids from one gene, from one bacteria to next. And as we discussed in the last lecture, you might be aware, plasmid is the extra chromosomal DNA present in prokaryotes and some eukaryotes, and plasmid is actually responsible for carrying antibiotic resistant genes. So, by the horizontal gene transfer of plasmids, the bacteria might also be able to transfer their drug resistance to other sensitive strains. But basically, this is direct observation. You can directly observe in the lab bacteria evolving and becoming resistant to the drugs that you're exposing them to. So, this is one thing which is direct observation, which happens at a smaller time scales that they are actually observable by us. So, an example of this is how drug resistance developed in this bacteria called Staphylococcus aureus. So, what happened was in like the early 1940s, in 1940, so Staphylococcus was actually causing diseases in humans, and that is why researchers came up with this drug penicillin. It was introduced, and it was very effective against Staphylococcus and all of the um, it was a very good treatment, and all the patients uh, were getting treated with this drug, and they were becoming like they were getting healed of the diseases that they developed from staphylococcus. One second. Yeah, so they were becoming uh, so they were getting okay after being treated with penicillin. Then what happened is in like these 5 years, Staphylococcus aureus actually became resistant to penicillin. As I discussed, as if you keep exposing the bacteria to the same drug, eventually it'll become resistant to it, because now the strains that are not resistant or that are sensitive to the drug will be wiped out, and the strains or the bacteria that carry the resistance will multiply much faster, and so the entire staphylococcus will now become resistant to penicillin. So eventually in 1946 we observed that staphylococcus aureus has developed penicillin resistance. Then what happened was after like 10 years another drug was introduced, vancomycin, and then another drug was introduced called methicillin. But even after the introduction of methicillin, in a few years, in like 2 to 3 years, Staphylococcus aureus even developed methicillin resistance. So now this variety or the strains of Staphylococcus are getting resistant to different types of drugs as well. So eventually, this term called MRSA, multi-drug resistant Staphylococcus aureus, it came about in 1976 when we observed, or when humans observed, that Staphylococcus aureus is becoming resistant to all of these multiple different drugs that were used to treat it with. So this was an example for how we can directly observe evolution coming about. Moving on from here, second thing or another evidence is homology. So what is homology? Homology is actually some similarity that we observe in terms of, say, some body parts and the position of the body part and the structure of the body parts, and this might indicate some common ancestry. Okay, so it's the degree of similarity in terms of position or structure of certain body parts, and it might be indicating common ancestry. So you can see here that we have humans, we have whales, we have lizards, we have hummingbirds, we have these vertebrates. And if we compare the arms or the flippers or the, say, the forelimbs of these organisms, we see that the bone structure, so you can see the bones in the same color. So this bone structure is actually similar, but they've just evolved in different ways to fulfill their function in these different organisms. So in humans, you see, so we all have, we all of these organisms have radius and ulna, all of these different, we all of them have humerus. So eusthenopteron is actually extinct now, and it is a very old it's an aquatic organism. It was present in old in ancient times, but now it's extinct. So what we observe even now is that even that organism, even Eusthenopteron, had the similar forelimb structure, had the similar bone structures. It had a humerus, a radius, and ulna, and then these carpals and metacarpals that form our fingers. And similar is present in the flippers of a whale. It's present in the forelimbs of lizards, and in birds, it's actually fused to form the wings. So, this homology or this similarity in the bone structures in different organisms actually explains that, in some sense, all of us shared a common ancestor from which these different limbs or these different bones have evolved in slightly different ways to fulfill the niches in which we live, to help us adapt to the environments in which we live, and to do the functions that we do with these structures. So, that is what is homology. Another example of homology is leaves. So you can look at plants. So, for example, leaf is modified into different structures in these different plants. First of all, we have a pitcher plant. A pitcher plant is actually an insectivorous plant in which the leaf is modified to resemble like a pitcher or a jug, which is filled with enzymes which can kill the insects that enter into it. And what happens is, when these insects they fall into this jug, which is filled with enzymes, the lid closes, and these can then be the food of the insects can then be digested by the plants. So that is one modification of the leaf. Another modification is seen in Venus flytrap. This is also an insectivorous plant, and the leaves are modified into jaws that can catch insects. And the leaves are actually lined with sensitive hair. And when an insect walks onto these leaves, when it touches multiple of these sensitive hair, they actually the two sides of the leaf they shut onto the insect, and it gets digested eventually in the fly trap. Then you have this poinsettia. It has these bright red colored leaves, which actually look like flowers, but they're not. They resemble flower petals, but they are not actually flowers. They're just leaves that are very brightly red colored. And it's very commonly used in like gardening and in home decor. And then you have cactus. In cactus, you know that leaves to save water, to prevent transpiration of water. Cactus has all of its leaves converted into spines so that there is no loss of water. So this is another homology between how leaves can form different structures in different plants. Then it's not just in these physical features that we see homology, but even in behavior. For example, there are these two species of bowerbirds. One is the McGregor's bowerbird, and one is the satin bowerbird. The McGregor bowerbird actually builds a very tall tower of sticks, and it decorates it with bits of charcoal. And why do they make these bowers? Is actually to the males, they make these bowers in order to attract the females, in order to attract mate. And the females will come here and inspect the bower and look at how well it has been made, and then it'll choose either to mate or not to mate with this specific male. So what the McGregor's bowerbird do is that they build a tall tower of sticks, and then they decorate it with with bits of charcoal. And the satin bowerbird, it also makes a bower, and but actually it makes a channel in between its bower and it decorates it with bright blue objects. So even though these are different species, but we can now make, so if a researcher or an ornithologist would have stepped into the jungle and have not known that these two species are actually like what are these two species, maybe they were unidentified, but if he observed this phenomena, he could have taken a guess that they might actually be related to each other because their mating strategies are pretty similar. So their ancestors of these bowerbirds, the species that they all evolved from, might also actually be using the same behavior in order for mate attraction, in order to attract the opposite gender to come and mate with them. So even behavioral strategies are actually evolved, and they also share some kind of a homology between each other. Moving on to what is convergent evolution. So there are these two terms, convergent evolution and divergent evolution. It's very important to keep a clear distinction between these two terms and remember what is convergent and what is divergent. Convergent evolution, as the term suggests, it is actually an independent evolution of similar features in species that are not really related to each other. So, for example, in very distinctly related species, um, that may have evolved, may be evolving very separately in their own trajectories, in very far away from each other in the globe, but they evolved to have some very similar features. And that might just be because they live in very similar environments on a local scale, and they might be utilizing the same niches in these environments. So if they're using the same niche, so if they are exploiting the same resources, then they can evolve the similar features. So this is what is convergent evolution. So even if genetically they are very distinct, they are very far off, they're not related to each other closely genetically, but phenotypically they're very similar because they are because these features have evolved to look very similar to each other. One example is these organisms. These, there are sharks which actually belong to the fish category. There is ichthyosaurus which belongs to the reptile category or the dinosaurs, and there is cetaceans which actually have evolved from mammals. So terrestrial mammals, they have actually evolved into cetaceans which are aquatic mammals. So sharks have actually evolved 450 million years ago, then ichthyosaurs evolved 250 million years ago, and cetaceans evolved 50 million years ago. So you can see that they've not even evolved close to each other. They've evolved very far off in time scales as well. But all of them have a similar body structure. They're all streamlined. They all have so yeah, I was talking about convergent evolution, and you can see here in this image that these all of these three different organisms, sharks, ichthyosaurs, and cetaceans, all of them, even though they are very far apart in when they evolved and to which group they belong to, fish, reptile, and mammal, respectively, they all have very similar features. For example, in terms of having a streamlined body, which makes them adept to maneuver their way through the ocean. So this is what is convergent evolution. Another example is of these two very similar looking organisms. One is actually a sugar glider, which is found in Australia, which is a marsupial, which is a pouched mammal. And the other is a North American flying squirrel. So it is a placental mammal. It is not a marsupial at all. But both of them look very similar, and they've evolved this fleshy appendage which helps them into gliding between trees. So because they live in similar habitats, because they're using the similar niche, that is why um, this is also an example of convergent evolution. So these two, the sugar glider and the flying squirrel, are not at all genetically they're not genetically close to each other, because one of them, as I said, is a marsupial and the other is a placental mammal. But they look very similar to each other, and that is a very strong example of convergent evolution, because they might be utilizing the similar niches, or they might be occupying similar habitats. Okay. Coming to divergent evolution, so as I said, or as the term suggests, divergent evolution actually means when a single species, it evolves into multiple different species. So one common ancestor evolving into many different species, all having different traits. So when you look at them, you might think that they all come from different ancestors, but actually they're coming from one single ancestor. So it's also called, another term is adaptive radiation. So when one particular ancestor evolves into with many different traits, or with many different varieties of the same trait. That is one way in which it has adaptively radiated in that area. For example, if you introduce an organism, for example, if you take an example of Darwin's finches, so from the mainland, the finches got introduced into the Galapagos Islands, where there were no other birds utilizing any of these niches. So in the Galapagos Islands, once these birds reached so once these finches they reached the Galapagos Islands, different populations started using different resources. Some of them were seed eating, some of them were feeding on leaves, some of them were feeding on very big seeds, some of them were feeding on small seeds, some of them were feeding on insects, things like that. So they developed very different beak structures. But if you look at them, they are all genetically related by a common ancestor. All of these finches, they are related by one common ancestor, which has actually radiated or divergently evolved into having these different traits and into these different species. So this is how divergent evolution is different from convergent evolution. In convergent evolution, the species are very far off. They're not genetically closely related, but phenotypically they look similar. And in divergent evolution, it's the opposite. The species are actually genetically related, but by a common ancestor, but they phenotypically look very different from each other. Okay. Another example is the marsupial radiation that happened in Australia. So, as you might be aware, marsupials are very commonly found in Australia and in some parts of South America and North America, but they have actually radiated in the island of Australia because there were no other mammals to actually occupy these different niches. And so these marsupials, so there came the Tasmanian wolf, which could be thought of as the counterpart of the mammalian wolf that we have in other parts of the world. So, because here these niches were not being occupied by any other organisms, so these marsupials radiated into forming the wolf, the tiger cat, the banded rat, the kangaroo, the wombat, the koala, all of these marsupials. Okay, moving on. So this was homology. So this was all about homology. So we have discussed two evidences of evolution so far. One of them is direct observation, and one of them is homology. Coming to the next evidence, which is fossil records. So you might be aware that fossils are actually these so when an organism dies and it gets, say, pressed between the layers of rocks, its bones and all of the structure that gets preserved. So these preserved bones or these preserved records can be looked at later by for example, they're being looked at now by archaeologists, by paleontologists, and they study these bones, they study these fossil records. These can be actually shells, bones, anything that can be preserved over time, and will not actually be deteriorated or say by bacteria or fungi or things like that, but it tritivores. So all of these preserved records, they are actually thought to be a missing link between the extinct and the extant species. So to just explain these two terms, extinct species are the ones that no longer exist on the face of the earth, and extant species are the ones that are actually existing now, that are actually present on earth right now. So fossil records help us, and they form this missing link between all of the extinct species and the species that are existing right now. So in this image, you can see actually that, or you might already be aware, birds have actually evolved from reptiles and, to be more correct, from dinosaurs. So that was actually made clear when somebody came across this fossil or Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx is a dinosaur which could fly and looked very similar to birds and had these similar structures like wings and a tail and things like that. And when they actually came across this fossil, they could link that birds have actually evolved from dinosaurs, and that is why birds are called glorified reptiles. So they've actually come from reptiles because dinosaurs evolved from reptiles. Then another example is of the evolution of whales. Whales are actually they've actually evolved from terrestrial mammals, and these mammals, once they started, so you can see here in this structure, this thing looks like a normal. This Pachycetus looks like a normal by um, four-limbed mammal on the face of the earth, and then it evolved eventually into something that has a very this is called Dorodon, which is very close to the whales. So they, you can see here in this silhouette that it looks very similar to the aquatic whales that we see now. So from this to this, fossils help us link um, these organisms. So it's fossils that help us see that, okay, this organism actually evolved in some way and its limbs got altered, limbs became shorter, pelvis became shorter, and that is how it became a whale. So when you look at cetacean evolution, or the evolution of cetaceans in general, which are aquatic mammals, you see that they have evolved from terrestrial mammals. They do not come from fish. They evolved from terrestrial mammals, and they had these following changes happen to them so that they could adapt to a aquatic lifestyle. One of them is that they have a very uniquely shaped tympanic bone, which helps them to hear underwater. The nasal openings, as you can see in this image, 47 million years ago in these mammals, the nasal openings were very close, were very are like the um, are like the mammals that we have right now. Like in dogs, you'll see that the nose is close to the mouth. But in these cetaceans with evolution, you see that the nasal opening has actually moved to the back of the skull so that they can like swim up to the layer of the water and take in air, right? So if it was close to the mouth, again, it would be difficult for them to take in air. So it's the nasal opening moved to the back of the skull so that they can come to the surface of the water and breathe. Then the elbow, wrist, and fingers are all now in the flippers. All of those bones you can see, find them in the flippers, and the pelvis is quite rudimentary, because they do not require it for swimming. It will not help them. So here you can see in this image, that from these organisms, it how it has changed from pachycetus, as we saw in the last image, from pachycetus to ambulocetus to durodon, and then to the Bellina whales, right? You can see how these things have changed, the bone structure has changed, and you can follow the evolution of cetaceans via the fossil records. Coming to the last evidence of evolution that was discussed was biogeography. Biogeography, you might be aware of this or might not. It's actually the study of distribution of organisms and ecosystems, and how these organisms and ecosystems are distributed across space, geographical space, and in geological time, how these distributions have changed, and how these organisms have moved around, or the how the distribution of continents has also changed. So Darwin and Wallace were actually responsible for popularizing biogeography as well. And here you can see that there is this so earlier, all of these continents, you might be aware, were actually together in one place called Pangaea, and then there was Laurasia and Gondwana land, which we'll come to in the next slide. And you can see here that these organisms in South America and Africa, there was this overlapping of this organism, and then there was this over these particular plants was found all over in South America, Africa, India, Australia, all of these continents. So now if you go and find these plants and you see, oh my god, how is the same plant found in like South America and Africa and India when all of these continents are so far apart, you can know that this plant dates back to further back to when these continents were actually close to each other in space, and it's not a very recent organism. So like that, here you can also see the distribution of marsupials. Marsupials are actually distributed in Australia, Antarctica, and South America. And now you see that because these continents have moved apart from each other, they are just they're endemic, or they are restricted in their ranges to Australia and South America and some parts of North America. But all the rest of the continents do not have any marsupials in them. So this is how studying biogeography, looking at distribution of organisms through time, helps you understand evolution and where these different organisms came from and what was their locations. Coming to continental drift, first of all, around 225 million years ago, all of the landmass was combined together into one big landmass, which is called Pangaea. Then eventually, around 200 million years ago, there were these two distinct landmasses. As you can see from these shapes here, you can make out that this here has separated, and it came to be called the Gondwana land and Laurasia. And then Laurasia was actually comprised of Asia and Europe, and Gondwana land included South America, Africa, India, and Australia. And in the Jurassic period, India also got, or in the Triassic period itself, India is actually separated from the Gondwana land and started moving. In the Jurassic, it's drifting towards Asia, and South America and Africa are also separating, Australia is also coming out, and then eventually, as you see in the Cretaceous period, all these continents have actually started taking the shape of what they look like, a little bit of what they look like now, but they are still traveling in the ocean, moving towards their respective positions, or not respective positions, to their newer positions. And currently, right now, this is what the continents look like. There is Asia, there is this Indian plate which has moved from here to here and now connected with Asia. There is Australia, Africa, Europe, North America, and South America. So this is how continental drift came about, from like 225 million years ago to now. Okay, now having looked at this, having looked at what are these different evidences of evolution, let's talk about what is the significance of evolution. Why do we need to study evolution? Why do we need to know about evolution? What is the requirement? So one thing is that it is important to understand evolution. First of all, one thing that I feel is that it's important to know about evolution because it's important as individuals or in general to know where you've come from. Everybody, like, humans are mostly of the thought that humans are the superior species. We are like very different from all the other non-human animals and things like that. But it is very important to realize that we are actually all related to each other, and we are not very different from other organisms. We might have had different evolutions over the time, but we're not that different from other organisms. So it's important to keep that in mind. That is, according to me, that is one important point why we need to know about evolution. Another thing is, if you're dealing with vaccine development, if you work with in pharmaceuticals, if you're talking about medicine development, treating diseases, you need to understand evolution, because as we discussed, these organisms or these bacteria that you're creating the vaccines for, or the viruses, they will evolve, and they will very quickly evolve and become resistant to these vaccines and the medicines that you developed. So you need to also keep on changing your vaccines, keep on changing your medicines, so as to treat these diseases better. Second thing is, because humans are so much dependent on agriculture, a lot of our food comes from agriculture. It's important to know about evolution, because that is what will help us to develop better, newer species and to breed better, higher yielding crops, which might require lesser resources but still give you more yields. So that is, agriculture will be helped if you understand evolution better. And another thing is to conservation of endemic species. So you might not be aware of what are endemic species, you might not have heard the term before, but endemism is actually when certain species are restricted in their ranges to a certain area, and they're found only there and not anywhere else in the world. For example, there are many endemic species in India itself, because India has this hotspots of Himalayas and Western Ghats. And Western Ghats has so many endemic species of birds, plants, animals which are not found anywhere out of the Western Ghats. So these species are much more threatened. They can get extinct much faster because they have very small populations in this very restricted area. And if anything happens to this restricted landmass, if there is, say, a catastrophe, an earthquake, heavy rains, anything like that, then these might get extinct. So to understand all of this, to understand where these species came from, what were they, where were they biogeographically present in the past, and where they're now, and where they can be distributed. Other than this, what are the climate changes that happened over time? What do these species require? These all can help you come up with conservation strategies to save these endemic species, because it is very important. There are so many species out there in the world that we're not even aware that they exist. They might not have been discovered as of yet, even. So it's very important to conserve all of these endemic species, because they might just be getting lost because of anthropogenic actions, because of how humans have been affecting their environments. Okay, so these are some of the significances of evolution, or why do we even care about evolution. Then coming to what are the different mechanisms by which evolution comes about, and as you might be aware, because this is something that is taught in, like, if you had biology in your high school in +1 and +2, you might have come across these terms of natural selection, mutation, genetic drift, gene flow. These are some of the mechanisms by which evolution comes across. And evolution, as you might know, it's changes in certain traits within populations over generations. Okay, and so, what is natural selection? We have already discussed this a little bit. Natural selection is a process by which organisms that are better adapted to their environment, they're more likely to survive and reproduce, and they're more likely to pass on their genes to the progeny, while those that are less adapted, they tend to be eliminated. So, evolution, very simply explained, if there are organisms in a population and some of them are better adapted, as compared to the other ones, that the ones that are better adapted, they'll be able to leave behind a higher number of progeny, a higher number of their gene copies in the next generation. And the ones which are less adapted will leave a lesser number of progeny, less number of gene copies. And eventually, over time, the ones that are better adapted will leave more and more progeny, and the one that is less adapted might just get eliminated. So that is how natural selection works. And I would like to give you an example of natural selection that happened because of humans, because of industrialization. So there is this peppered moth, and you can see in this image there is this peppered moth. It has these two variants. One of them is the light morph, in which there are very little black spotting and a lot of the moth looks white. And the other one is the dark morph, which has a lot of black spotting. So what happened was, in the olden days, the trees. So it's found somewhere in Europe, and in the olden times, before industrialization, the trees were actually covered with lichen. And you can see here in the lower half of the image, the white colored lichen. So the lichen covered the entire trees. And as you can see in this image, the white moths were well camouflaged against the lichen background, and the black morphs were not. They would stand out. So at that point, there were very few black morphs in the population of this peppered moth. And you would see the white morphs much more often. And because these black moths would be easily predated upon by the birds that feed on these moths. Okay. Then what happened was, then came in industrial revolution. Because of industrial revolution came in air pollution, and this air pollution lead to huge amounts of soot deposition over these trees, which turned the tree barks or the lichen covered trees from white to black. And now, as you might have already guessed, the dark morphs became better camouflaged against this black background or dark background of the tree barks, which were soot covered, and the white morphs which started to stand out. And so the birds were preferably, or the birds were able to pick out the white morphs much faster, which reduced their numbers. And the now the black morphs increased in the peppered moth population, and the white morphs went down. So this is what is natural selection. So it's not really choosing for something making you very different, making you very physically fit or things like that. It's actually just choosing for organisms or for varieties of traits that are better fit in that scenario. So in this scenario, it was just about the color. In the earlier days, when the trees were lichen colored, when they were light colored, the white morph of the moth fit better, and they were larger in numbers. And eventually, when the trees got soot covered, they were darker, then the dark morph was better suited. So this is just how the color trait got varied between um, these two traits. So the color trait got varied with time because of industrial revolution. Okay. So there are some five stages in natural selection. So let's see what are these five stages. Number one, there needs to be variation. So as we discussed, even for evolution, the traits need to have variation. So even for natural selection, there needs to be this variation that exists in the traits in the population, right? So there needs to be variation in the traits. Then there needs to be overpopulation. So for natural selection to occur, the population needs to be, or the area needs to be overpopulated, so that some of the individuals can actually be eliminated. So there needs to be overpopulation, and because of this overpopulation there will be a struggle for existence. So if we are in a cramped room, we will struggle to even, so if you're in an empty room, you'll be easily sitting and calm and relaxed. But if you are in a jam packed room, you will actually be struggling to even just sit there comfortably. So that's just an analogy I'm making. But in general, if there are organisms and they're overpopulated, then there will be a struggle for existence. Why? Because the resources are limited. The resources are not infinite. And because these resources are limited, these organisms will actually be competing against each other to reach the resources. And that is what leads to this struggle for existence. So, first of all, you require variation in traits. You require there to be overpopulation and struggle for existence. Then, because of this struggle for existence, there will be a survival of the fittest. So, organisms that are better adapted to live in that particular environment, they will actually survive better. And the ones that are not well adapted to survive in that environment will not be surviving that well, will not be leaving behind uh, a high amount of progeny. So, survival of the fittest can actually be also thought of as differential reproductive success, because the ones that are better adapted will have a higher reproductive success as compared to the ones that are not well adapted to survive in that particular environment. And this will eventually lead to a change in the gene pool. For example, in the peppered moth example, in the peppered moth, if the white moths, uh, the genes for the white moths were actually pretty common before industrialization, and the gene for for the dark moths were pretty rare. But after industrialization, after all this happened, after there was struggle for existence and survival of the fittest or differential reproductive success, you now see a change in the gene pool, with the genes for the white moths being much rarer as compared to the genes for the black moths, which have become more frequent because all the trees have now a dark background and the dark moths just fit better. Okay, I hope this was clear. What are these five stages of natural selection and why natural selection occurs through these? Another way to explain this a little bit better is that, okay, you see, there is this butterfly population, and there are these two morphs again. One of them is the yellow morph, and one of them is the brown morph, right? So there are these two morphs, two color morphs in this population of butterflies. So there is this variation in the color trait, right? Then why is there competition? Is because, for example, both of them are laying eggs, and both of them produce a lot of larvae. So now there is overproduction of these offsprings, which lead to a competition of survival, because some of them will get eaten up by predators, and some of them will not be able to get a good amount of resources, for example, because resources is also limited. So in this example, let's talk about, if you're looking at competition in terms of being predated upon. So here in this dark background of the bark of the tree, or the ground, whatever is being depicted here, there will be a competition of survival between between the larvae of these two different colored butterfly morphs. So the darker morphs of the larvae will actually survive better because they will be difficult to be picked out by the birds here, which are which are consuming these larvae. And the lighter or the brightly colored larvae will actually get picked up much faster. Then eventually, so that will lead to a selection for the darker colored morph. And so eventually you'll see that over generations there will be a change in the allele frequency, because now the brown morph will be more common than the brightly colored morph. Okay, so I hope this was clear. Now let's come to this question of fitness and adaptation. What is fitness and what is adaptation? So we've been talking about survival of the fittest, and the species that is well adapted will survive better, will leave behind more progeny. So what exactly is fitness and what is adaptation? So when you talk about fitness, fitness is actually the ability of an organism or ability of an animal to leave behind more offsprings in the future generations compared to other organisms. So in case of Darwinian fitness, or in case of fitness, this is not the physical fitness that we talk about, going to a gym, become strong, make muscles. That is not the fitness that we're talking about in the context of evolution. In the context of evolution, the fitness that we're talking about is actually Darwinian fitness or reproductive fitness. And that is why we're actually talking about that fitness, or an organism is said to be fitter when it leaves behind a higher number of progeny as compared to the other organisms around it. Okay, so if you're talking about an animal or an organism, the one that is able to leave more of its gene copies, which means leaves behind more of the progeny, that is better fit, that is more fit compared to the other organisms. So that is what is fitness. And adaptation is an alteration in either the structure of an organism, or the behavior of an organism, or the function of an organism, by which that organism becomes better able to survive and better able to reproduce in its environment. So adaptation is any such trait. Any such trait could be a behavioral trait, could be a physical trait, any of these, which makes it better adapted to that particular environment, which makes it easier for the organism to survive in that environment and to reproduce and produce more of its copies. So that is an adaptation. So let me explain it again. Adaptation is any such trait which allows an organism to survive better in that environment and to produce more organisms. Take an example of the peppered moth. The adaptation is the trait color. So when the trees were lichen covered, then the white colored moth survived better. So the adaptation of having a lighter color was better. But when the trees became soot covered, when they were darker, then the adaptation of being darker colored was better. So, in both the cases, in the first case, being lighter was being better adapted to the environment, and in the second case, after industrialization, being darker was being better adapted to the environment. Fitness, in the first case, before industrialization, the white morphs were were better fit in their environment. They were leaving behind more progeny because the black morphs were being picked up by the predators. In the second case, after industrialization, the darker morphs were better adapted, or they were fitter. They were leaving behind more progeny as compared to the lighter morphs. Okay, I hope this is clear. Now, another mechanism by which evolution happens is mutation. So, we've already discussed natural selection and how it functions and what are the different stages of natural selection, or what are the different requirements for natural selection to happen. Now, let's look at the second mechanism by which evolution may come about. It is mutation. So, what is mutation? Would have already come across these terms multiple times in your life. And mutation actually is any change in the genotype of an individual. So, genotype, we now know it's the genes, it's the DNA which carries the genes, and any change in this genes, in this DNA of an organism is called a mutation. So, since we have discussed that there are some silent mutations, there are some nonsense mutations, missense mutations, this and that. So, you might already know that not all of these mutations can cause evolution. Okay, not all of them. And another thing to know is not all of the mutations happen in the germline cells. So we have germline cells and we have somatic cells. So there are germline mutations and somatic mutations. Somatic mutations, for example, some mutation that might have happened on your skin, that will not get passed on to your progeny. For something to get passed on to the progeny, that mutation needs to happen in the germline. That mutation needs to happen in the gametes. Okay. So only those mutations that happen in the gametes, that happen in the germline, can cause evolution. If Because this mutation needs to be heritable. If the mutation is not heritable, then it will not cause evolution. Okay, mutation is any change in the genotype of an individual, and if this mutation is heritable, it might be able to cause evolution. So, for example, stand another thing to keep in mind, not all of the mutations. So, we always hear mutation is thought of as a negative term, but not all of the mutations are negative. Some of them are neutral, some of them are beneficial, and then there are some which are actually harmful. For example, in this image, you can see that this cat's ears are actually curled a little bit behind, which you don't actually see in all of the cats. And this cat ear curl is actually a very neutral mutation. It does not really cause any repercussions in the cat. It is not affected by this ear curl, and neither is its reproductive success affected by this ear curl. So it is a neutral mutation. Then this mutation of becoming um, resistant to a certain drug. For example, here we're talking about pesticides. So, pests or insects becoming resistant to the pesticide is actually a beneficial mutation for the insect. If you're looking at it from the point of view of the insect, it is a beneficial mutation for the insect because now it has become resistant to that insect to that pesticide, to that drug. It will no longer be affected and can leave behind more progeny. And then there are these mutations which are actually harmful. For example, there is Down syndrome. It leads to these Down syndromes. The people who are affected. They actually have delay in their development, delay in their brain development, delay in their body development. They are actually have a lot of these um, problems that they have to face. So, this is an example of a negative mutation that is not helpful. So, there are neutral mutations, beneficial mutations, and there are some negative mutations or some harmful mutations that actually lead to diseases. So, this is all about mutations, and in all of these scenarios, evolution will happen only if that mutation is heritable. Okay, if it is happening in the gametes or in the germline. Now, coming to another process by which evolution happens, one of them is genetic drift. Okay, uh, 1 minute. Yeah, so let's talk about genetic drift. So, what is genetic drift? Genetic drift is actually a change in the frequency of an allele. An allele, as you might already be aware now, it's a variant of a gene. All right. For example, here we have red colored and blue colored beetles. So this color is the gene, and red and blue is actually the allele. So the change in the frequency of an existing gene variant in a population, which is happening because of some random chance. So the allele frequency is getting altered. The allele frequency is getting changed in this case also, but it is happening because of a random chance. So if you had, say, the peppered moth in this example, if randomly some of the moths were dying and now you have white morphs more than dark morphs, that is not because of natural selection. That is they're not being selected, or they're not being better adapted or not better adapted. It just happened because of chance. Okay, so if there is a change in allele frequency in a population due to a random chance event, that is called genetic drift. Genetic drift affects all populations, but the effect is more profound in small populations because some of these alleles might just get wiped out. So if you have a population of only 10 individuals, out of which say 5 are blue and 5 are red, and like this here you see that there is a certain SWOT, and 4 of the blue ones die because they were together in a space. Now you'll have suddenly the ratio will change to 10 is to 2. There will be 10 red ones and 2 blue ones. So suddenly the number of the blue ones from half it came down to one fifth, and that has happened because of a random event of somebody just killing them, right? So it does not mean that they got naturally selected or anything. It was just a random change in the allele frequency due to a chance event. Okay, that is what is genetic drift. Moving on to gene flow. So one of the last mechanisms by which evolution can happen is actually gene flow. And by the term, as you might have gotten an idea by the term itself, gene flow, it's actually the movement of individuals, and consequently they take with them their genes within populations. So when there are two different populations that can actually and there is movement happening between these two populations, there is gene flow happening between them. For example, there is this mountain range where there is a pass in between. Say there are two populations, there's a western deer population on the west side and there's an eastern deer population on the east side. But if they can pass through this gap in between the mountain range, then there is gene flow between these two populations. And if there is a barrier to gene flow, then what happens is called speciation. So for example, there was no gap, or this gap gets filled up by the mountain range. Say the mountain range expands and this gap gets filled up, then the western deer population will not be able to mix up with the eastern deer population, and eventually what we'll have are two different species of deer on the two different sides of the mountain. Okay, so that is how, if there is a barrier to gene flow, that will lead to speciation. And these barriers, they can be anything. They can be physical, for example, mountain range, or like a river in between, or like an or they can actually be anything else that can deter gene flow. For example, um, you have, say, different mating times. For example, the eastern deer population actually mated in August, while the western deer population mated in January. Then of course they'll not be able to there will be no gene flow between these two populations, because their mating times are so far apart that they'll not be mating at the same time, so there will not be any gene flow between them. So these are some barriers to gene flow. And so I hope it is clear by now. Gene flow is actually when there is a movement of individuals and along with them a movement of genes between two populations, and it actually reduces the differences between the two populations, and it increases the similarity between the two populations. If there is a constant gene flow, then the populations are getting similar to each other and less differentiated from each other. But if there's a barrier to the gene flow, the populations will eventually develop, you know, they will start accumulating their own mutations, their own changes, and they'll develop into two different species altogether, which will, even if they're put together in the same space, they will not be able to reproductively produce viable offsprings. Okay, now let's talk about sexual dimorphism. So, what is sexual dimorphism? Sexual dimorphism is actually, as the term suggests, dimorphism means, di means two, morph means appearance. And so dimorphism is when there is a difference in appearance in the males and the females of the same species. So it's sexual dimorphism. So if you have the same species but the male and the female look different, that's called sexual dimorphism. You might have observed this, for example, in the lions. Lions have their mane but the lionesses don't. You can see this in birds, for example, peacocks being a very, very common example, with peacocks having their extravagant tails while females will not. And then you have deer populations, for example, there are red deers in this, which with the male deers having these huge antlers and the female deers will not. So that is sexual dimorphism. And the cause for sexual dimorphism is more often sexual selection. Sexual selection is when selection is acting on traits that favor an individual's ability to secure a mate. So when selection is it's not happening to improve, its survival in the environment in general, but it is helping the organism get selected by the mates. So that is how it is leaving behind more progeny now. For example, if you have peacocks, there are two peacocks, one with the longer tail and one with the shorter tail. It's not that the longer tail peacock is surviving better in the environment or the shorter one is surviving better. Actually, the shorter one might be surviving better because it can fly around faster and can escape predators much quickly. But when it comes to mating, the peacock with the shorter tail will not get selected by the females, and the one with the longer tail will get selected by the females. And that is how now the peacock with the longer tail will be able to leave behind more progeny as compared to the peacock with the shorter tail, and eventually the population will have peacocks with longer and longer tails. So this is what is natural selection, oh, sexual selection, and it favors an individual's ability to secure a mate. And sexual selection, it creates a sexual selection pressure for certain features in the sexes, which actually might be costly to the individuals otherwise. As I explained, for peacock's tail, the carrying around a heavy tail might actually be costly for the peacock. It might make it more susceptible to predation, but because it is helping it get selected by the females and leaving behind more progeny, it is being selected over time. In the left image, you see red deers, and there are these two males there which are fighting with each other by interlocking their antlers. This actually, again, is not very helpful. The two males with this aggression, both of them might incur some costs, both of them might incur some injuries. But the one that wins the fight will actually secure the female mate. That is why they will engage in this battle, and one of them will win and will get to leave behind more progeny. Similar here is true for these horned beetles, where they are actually interlocking their horns and they're fighting, and one of them, which is the winner, will actually get to mate with the females. Okay, so this is what is sexual dimorphism and sexual selection. Now let's address some misconceptions about evolution. First misconception is within this image. This image shows us that, okay, there is like this gorilla which suddenly started walking erect and has become a modern human. So we know that this is actually just an artistic representation of evolution, but we should keep in mind that this is not how evolution happened. This is not how humans evolved. Not suddenly, it was not that suddenly chimpanzees and gorillas started walking upright and became humans. What happened was a very long process, and what is true is that we share common ancestors with chimps and gorillas, and actually we are most closely related to these chimps. Okay, we are very closely related to chimps, genetically closely related to chimps, and we all share. So, in general, all of the organisms on the planet Earth share a common ancestor. But when you're talking about humans and gorillas and chimps, we actually share a much more recent common ancestor as compared to when we talk about humans and, say, tigers, for example. So, the common ancestor between a human and tiger or human and elephant will be much older as compared to a common ancestor between humans and chimps, which will be much more recent in time. Okay, so this is one of the misconceptions in evolution. And what is true here is that humans and these different primate species, they share a common ancestor, and we have very recently, around 5 to 7 million years ago only, we have separated from chimps and bonobos. And chimps and bonobos have separated from each other around 1 million years ago, and we have separated from gorillas around 8 to 12 million years ago. So we share common ancestors with these different organisms, but it is not that suddenly one day one of the gorilla over time just started walking erect and became a human. That is not how it happened. Okay. So another question that was asked during this discussion of misconceptions being held in evolution is that evolution happens at a very slow pace, or it's mostly thought that evolution is happening because of gradualism and it happens at a very slow pace. So can rapid changes like not occur due to evolution? Are rapid changes not explainable by evolution at all? And the answer to this question is that evolution can actually happen really fast, or it can happen really slow. So evolution can happen over many different time scales. And how what is the pace of evolution actually depends on two factors. One of them being the generation type of the organism. Which organism are you talking about? If you're talking about, say, like humans, we evolve at a very slow pace because we live for like 100 years, right? And if you talk about elephants and turtles, they will take even more. But if you're talking about things like bacteria, which has a doubling time of like 20 minutes, in 20 minutes it gives rise to progeny, then it has a very small generation time. So it can evolve much faster than bigger organisms. And another thing to keep in mind is selection pressure. How strong is the selection pressure acting on that particular organism, on that particular species? That will also decide how fast evolution is happening. If the selection pressure, if you expose bacteria to a drug, and it will be under much more selection pressure to become resistant to that drug so that it can survive. So that is a very strong selection pressure, and that will cause evolution to happen faster than if you just leave that bacteria on a petri dish to normally live without any selection pressures. Then it will evolve slower than a bacteria which is exposed to a much stronger selection pressure. Okay, so there are these two factors on which the pace of evolution depends: the generation time of the organism and the selection pressure. Okay, now let's discuss about how can humans impact evolution. So evolution is something that is happening in nature. It is like a natural phenomenon. How are humans impacting evolution? So it's important to notice what impacts we have on the environment and other organisms, because more often than not, humans don't really realize how they are impacting other things. We just go on doing our own things, building cities, making transportation, making industries, without realizing how we are impacting other life forms on the planet. So humans can directly and indirectly cause evolution of other organisms. For example, when humans are altering habitats, when humans are cutting down forests, when they're destroying trees, when they are altering ecosystems, when they even introduce a certain species into a new area where it was not found earlier, or if they eliminate a certain species from a certain area altogether, these are all actions that create selection pressures on that species and cause them to evolve. For example, if you're logging down forests, now there is much less space for the birds, for the mammals to live in that area, and now they need to evolve in order to get used to exploiting, say, for example, their nearby village habitats, the urban habitats, because they do not have enough space for enough home range for them to live in the forest, because there's no longer that bigger forest patch left for them to stay in it. So they need to evolve these new strategies by which they can still go on living. They need to evolve these new strategies of exploiting these different resources that they're not used to exploiting before. For example, when you talk about human wildlife conflicts, when you see um, elephants raiding fields, when you see tigers or leopards going towards cattle as prey, that is happening because they do not have enough forest space to occupy, and they have now moved out of the forest a little bit, and what they come across as prey now is not their regular deer, but it's now a cattle that they find tied to a rope. So that is how humans are actually impacting evolution also. Introducing species to a new area, for example, humans are like have in many areas humans have actually introduced species without realizing the repercussions this might have. And there are now invasive species in all over the globe. There are invasive species everywhere. For example, in Indian forests, you have this thing called lantana camera, which is so invasive. It's such an invasive plant that it has actually wiped out a lot of the native species because it spreads very fast, and it's very difficult to actually stop its growth, to take out. Even if you pull out the plant, it will still grow again. So this again leads to impacts evolution. By introducing these new species, humans have not only impacted the evolution of the species that they introduced, but also of all the species that are actually found natively in this habitat. So that is how humans are impacting evolution of organisms around them without even realizing it. Okay. Yeah. And another thing to keep in mind is that it's not just us that are impacting organisms, but it's a two-way interaction. The organisms also impact us. So we are all actually co evolving in this environment. Okay. do humans evolve? So there is one misconception held that okay, humans are the superior beings, are the most superior organisms, and they don't need to evolve any further, and humans don't evolve. But that is incorrect. And humans, yes, humans do evolve. And one of the examples is, say, lactose tolerance. So, what happens is all of the mammals, when they are young, when they are young babies, they depend on their mothers for milk. And that is when in these young ages, they have, when they're cubs or when they're babies, they have the ability to digest lactose, because they have this enzyme lactase in them, which helps them digest lactose. Otherwise, lactose is a big sugar, and it's very difficult to digest lactose. So all of these organisms, as cubs, as babies, as kittens, as puppies, they are able to digest milk, because that is their only source of nutrition. But as they grow, as they become adults, they no longer, the body stops producing lactase, and they're no longer able to digest milk anymore, because they don't depend on milk anymore. They can actually fend for themselves, they can actually find food for themselves. But humans, when they started domesticating cattle, they had a lot of milk. They were harvesting milk from the cattle, they were collecting this milk, and they were consuming it. And you can see that in some humans are lactose intolerant, because they're not able to digest milk, and does not have like deadly impact, but it just gives them gas, gives them stomach problems. But other humans have actually started developing resistance to started developing tolerance to lactose, because they've evolved to do so, because they might have been more you know domesticated. There might have been more consumption of milk in those parts of the planet, of the globe. In this map, you can see there are certain areas. So lactose intolerance is more common in the red parts, and lactose intolerance is less common, or tolerance is more common in the white parts. So you can see here in Africa, in southern Africa, there is more lactose intolerance, but in northern Africa, there is more lactose tolerance. In Europe, there is more lactose tolerance. In Southeast Asia, there is less lactose tolerance. In some parts of India, there is more lactose tolerance. So, like this, humans have evolved lactose tolerance over the years because they have been consuming so much milk. Okay, now moving on. Do organisms become perfect after evolution? So, what is the goal of evolution? Is evolution making perfect organisms? Is natural selection going to make a super organism one day? So that is again a misconception, because perfection is actually relative. As we discussed in the example of those peppered moths, the perfection or the fitness in that case was only being white colored or black colored. There was nothing else. So perfection is very relative, and nature is not aiming for perfection. It is just putting selection pressures on organisms based on which environment they're found in, based on what are the constraints that they're facing in their environments, in their habitats. For example, those peppered moths, they were facing a constraint that the ones that stood out from the ones that could not blend into the background were being picked up by the predators, and their numbers were dwindling. So based on that, they were being naturally selected. The ones that blended well with the background, they were being they could leave behind more progeny, and the one that stood out were actually being picked up by predators and being eliminated from the population. So nature is not aiming for perfection. Nature is just putting these random selection pressures based on the environmental constraints, and natural selection leads to organisms that are well adapted to survive in that particular environment in which they are found, and to increase their numbers in that particular environment. They are not becoming like perfect organisms of some sorts. Okay, so it's important to keep this in mind. Now, the last lecture talked about human evolution, and it's important to know that humans are very recent. Humans always think that we are the superior most organisms. There is we are the best organisms, and there's nothing better than us. But it's important to know that we are very recent in the history of Earth came about 4.5 billion years ago. Earth is 4.5 billion years old. So billion is 10 to the power 9. So Earth is 4.5 into 10 to the power 9 years old. Then life on Earth is actually 3.7 billion years ago. Life in the sense of prokaryotes, in the sense of bacteria and these single celled organisms, these prokaryotes. Life is 3.7 billion years ago. And humans, in contrast, are very recent. Humans have evolved only zero point 0.2 million years ago. which, if you compare the numbers, not even billion. We have evolved only zero point 0.2 million years ago, which is actually only 2 lakh years ago have humans evolved or Homo sapiens evolved. So we are very recent on this planet. Looking at human evolution, so there is this phylogenetic tree where you see that we share common ancestors with chimps and bonobos, with gorillas and orangutans. So from orangutans, all of the other great apes, they actually diverged around 9 to 13 million years ago. Orangutans belong to the genus Pongo, and then came gorilla, which belongs to the genus gorilla only, gorilla. From them we diverged around 8 to 12 million years ago, and then the genus Homo, it diverged from chimps, which fall in the genus Pan, around 5 million years ago, 5 to 7 million years ago. And then it is only 1 million year ago that chimps and bonobos have actually diverged from each other. So, human evolution happened only, or like the genus Homo has separated or diverged from chimps only 5 to 7 million years ago. So, this is another tree that shows you the different, what do you call it, ancestors of humans. So we are at the very edge of this tree. This is Homo sapiens. Before this is the entire genus Homo with different species of the Homo genus, like the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, the Rudolfenses, the Erectus. All of these different species of Homo fall in this uh, clump here. Then there is this group called the Paranthropus. Then there is this group called the Australopithecus. And then there is this Ardipithecus. Ardipithecus is the oldest group. Its fossils date back to 4.4 million years ago. They are found in Ethiopia. They were all bipedal. They were arboreal, means they spent a lot of time on trees. Their canines, the teeth were similar to humans, means it was much smaller than the canines found in chimps and other apes, but the brain size was small and they did not engage in tool use. Then came about the Australopithecus group, and the fossil dates back to 3.75 million years ago. And the fossil is called Lucy. It's a female fossil of the Australopithecus. These were also bipedal, but they also have a small brain and they do not engage in tool use. Now, these are the characteristics of the genus Homo, that they have larger brains, they have bipedality, and they also use tools. Bipedality means they walk on two legs. They have larger brains and they engage in tool use. Now, this is some differences in from chimps to Ardipithecus, Australopithecus to Homo erectus to humans. Brain size, as you see, has significantly increased and has mostly increased only from chimpanzee to humans or Homo sapiens. So the brain size has increased over the years. Walking has changed. Are quadrupedal. Then Ardipithecus was bipedal, like some mostly bipedal, but still some of it was quadrupedal. Then you have Australopithecus, Homo erectus, and humans, which are actually bipedal. Then this is what we were talking about in canines. Chimpanzees have these big canines which are sharp and huge, but as you move on in Homo sapiens, the canine size starts decreasing because we don't require it based on our diet now. And coming to arboreality, chimpanzees and Ardipithecus were frequently arboreal. Some of the Australopithecus also engaged in tree living, but arboreality is very rare in Homo erectus was rare in Homo erectus and is still rare in Homo sapiens. Now, we discussed these different characteristics of humans having larger brains, being bipedal, walking on two legs, and using tools. Then comes some costs and benefits of this trait. So, when we talk about large brain size, how is it beneficial? So, having a large brain actually helps you collect more information, helps you process this information much faster. So, if we have a larger brain size, we can actually collect a lot of information about our surroundings and we can process it also very fast. We can store a lot more information. For example, if we're talking about early humans, they could store a lot of information about the direction in which they're going, where they found food last time, things like that. In solving complex problems, in imagining things, in abstract thinking and creativity, all of these are benefits of a larger brain size. But it comes with its due costs. Having a larger brain, the large brain consumes a lot of energy. The brain in our body has only 2% of the body weight, but it takes up 20% of the oxygen that we breathe in. 20% of the blood supply goes to the brain, 20% of the oxygen goes to the brain. So it takes up a lot of this. And that is why humans need to spend a lot of time sleeping in order to recharge, because otherwise the brain is using a lot of the oxygen that we are actually breathing in. And a larger brain size also leads to a difficulty in childbirth, because giving birth to a child with such a large head is actually very difficult for the pelvis of the human females. Coming to bipedality, how is bipedality helpful? Bipedality is helpful because when you stand on your two legs, you have a larger scan area. So you can scan over a large area around you for any approaching predators. Your hands are free, so you can use them for tools or for other things. Then you can actually pick up fruits from a higher strata. Since now you can stand on your two legs, you're not on your four legs, you can reach higher strata and you can pick up this fruit or food that you find in the higher strata. And you can act to be large and you can look large and intimidating to other organisms. Other organisms which are walking on four legs, they are at a lower height than humans, and they can think of humans as being large and intimidating. Some costs that come with bipedality is having lower back pain, which is very frequent in humans, slipped discs, arthritis of the hips and knees, and collapsed foot arches. So these are some costs that bipedality comes with. Moving on to what are the different species found in the genus Homo. So in Homo, okay, we have this one Australopithecus afarensis, but in Homo we find these species: Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo sapiens. We have other species also. We have these species called um, Homo rudolfensis, we have Homo florens, we have Homo habilis. So all of these different species fall under the genus Homo. Now we'll just talk about two of these species, Neanderthals and Denisovans, which were quite recent. Neanderthals actually date back 2.4 to zero point zero 0.04 million years ago. Their fossils are found in Eurasia. They coexisted along with Denisovans and Homo sapiens. They had a wide nose, probably to deal with the humidity of the air. They had a broad forehead. They had a big brain. They could sophisticatedly use tools, and they were very good hunters. Sapiens and Neanderthals are thought to have interbred at some point in the history. And some of the traits that were influenced by Neanderthals is that they were those of having skin lesions, UTIs, which is urinary tract infections, tobacco addictions, depression, increased amount of blood coagulation, having a stronger immune system, and some of these people which carried these Neanderthal genes have actually severe COVID-19. So this is all about Neanderthals. And coming to the last one, which is Denisovans. Denisovans are quite recent. They are around 30,000 years ago. They were on the planet. They were found in Asia and Siberia. They their fossils are found in these areas. They lived in these areas. They coexisted with sapiens, and might also have interbred with sapiens. And it's thought that Tibetans might have acquired some traits or some genes from these Denisovans, which makes them conducive to high altitudes. Since Denisovans lived in these cold areas of Siberia, they were actually had hemoglobin, which was very good at carrying oxygen to the through the blood. So Tibetans, which are also very conducive to living in these high altitudes with low oxygen, they are thought to have acquired some of these genes from Denisovans. So this was all about the lectures from the week. Now let's come to the question and answer session for today. I will I will put forth the questions and wait for like 10 seconds for you guys to guess the answer, and then I will reveal the answer after 10 minutes. 10 seconds. Okay. First question is, what is evolution? The sudden appearance of a new species, the change in the genetic traits of a population over generations, the process by which. Okay, one second. Yeah. So, what is evolution? Is it the sudden appearance of a new species, the change of genetic traits of a population over generations, the process by which individuals acquire new traits during their lifetime, or the movement of genes between different species? So, which of these is evolution? Is it suddenly a new species that appear? Is it the change in genetic traits in a population over generations? It is the process by which individuals acquire new traits during their lifetime, or is it the movement of genes between different species? And the correct answer is actually the change in the genetic traits of a population over generations is actually called evolution, right? So evolution is the change in genetic traits of a population happening over generations. Which scientist is credited with the theory of the evolution by natural selection? So, which of these scientists is credited with the theory of evolution by natural selection? Is it Gregor Mendel? It is Charles. Is it Charles Darwin? Is it Louis Pasteur or Carolus Linnaeus? Which of these? Yeah, so as you might have already guessed, the correct answer to this question is actually Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin came up with the theory of natural selection. Next question. Which of the following is not a requirement for natural selection? Which of these is not required for natural selection? Is it variation in traits, inheritance of traits, equal reproductive success for all individuals, or differential survival and reproduction? Which of these is actually not required for natural selection? Yeah. And so the correct answer to this question is equal reproductive success for all individuals. This is something that is not required for natural selection. You don't require them to have equal reproductive success. You do require differential success in reproduction. Next question. An example of natural selection in action is farmers breeding cows for more milk production, antibiotic resistance in bacteria, a person lifting weights to become stronger, or a dog learning a new trick. Which of these is natural selection? Yeah. So the correct answer to this question, as you might have already guessed, is actually antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Because farmers breeding cows for milk production is not really natural selection. That is where humans are actually selecting the cows. And a person lifting weights is actually happening in their lifestyle, in their lifetime, and it's not going to make their progeny become stronger. And a dog learning a new trick again is something that is very individualistic. Genetic drift is it a random change in allele frequency? Is it the intentional selection of certain traits, a type of natural selection, or the movement of genes between populations? So what which of these is genetic drift? Yeah, so the correct answer is that a genetic drift is a random change in allele frequencies. Moving on to gene flow. Gene flow increases what? Which of these things is increased by gene flow? Is it genetic differences between populations, genetic similarity between population, risk of extinction, or the rate of genetic drift? What of these is actually increased by gene flow? So the correct answer to this question is that gene flow increases the genetic similarities between populations. Choose the characteristics of fitness. So this is a multiple things might be correct. So in this you have to choose what are the characteristics of fitness. Is fitness environment specific? Is fitness species specific? High reproductive rate means higher fitness. Fitness should be measured across several generations, and fitness works on traits such as size and speed. So which of these is a characteristic of fitness? So the correct answer is the A, B, and D. Fitness is environment specific, fitness is species specific, and it should be measured across several generations. So why C is not an option is because high reproductive rate does not really mean that they're leaving behind more progeny. Their progeny also needs to be viable and surviving better. Or like surviving in the so you need to leave behind more gene copies, so your progeny needs to be surviving also. Reproductive rate just means that you are reproducing more often than others, but that does not ensure a higher fitness. Okay. Next question. What is the closest living relative of modern humans? Which of these is the closest living relative of modern humans? Gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, or lemurs? Let's see. Yeah, so the correct answer to this question is chimpanzees, as we discussed. Chimps and humans only diverged around 5 to 7 million years ago, right? Convergent evolution occurs when? When does convergent evolution occur? Two unrelated species evolve similar traits due to similar environments. A species splits into multiple new species. A species goes extinct due to environmental pressures. Or different species evolve from a common ancestor. So, convergent evolution, when does it occur? So the correct answer to this question is that conversion evolution occurs when two unrelated species evolve similar traits due to similar environments. So they are not genetically related, but they have similar traits because they are living in similar environments. Next question. Through sexual selection, females of a species will select stronger and more healthier males, more prettier males, males that can call louder, or males that indicate any of the above. Yeah. So the correct answer to this question is that males that indicate any of the above. They can either be stronger, healthier, prettier, or they got called louder because all of these are thought to be, in some sense, they're thought to be signals about their fitness only, about their being better fit for the environment. Okay. Ardipithecus evolved dash chimpanzees while dash evolved before Homo erectus. So fill in the blanks. Is it before in Australopithecus, before in humans, after Australopithecus, or after in humans? Ardipithecus evolved when, and while dash evolved before Homo erectus. So the correct answer to this question is that Ardipithecus actually evolved before chimpanzees, while Australopithecus evolved before Homo erectus. So why we are saying that Ardipithecus evolved before chimpanzees is because humans are like the genus Homo got separated from chimpanzees around 5 to 7 million years ago. So Ardipithecus would have gotten separated even before that. And chimpanzees only are getting separated from bonobos around 1 to 1.5 million years ago, right? Okay. Lucy was one of the first evidence of dash fossil dating back to dash million years ago was found in dash in the African continent. So what is the correct answer? Dinosaur 70 million years ago Ethiopia, Australopithecus 3.7 million years ago Ethiopia, Ardipithecus 4 million years ago Ethiopia, or Homo erectus 1 million years ago Ethiopia. So who is Lucy? How old does she date back, and where was the fossil found? So the correct answer to this question is that Lucy is one of the first evidence of Australopithecus. It dates back to 3.75 million years ago and it's found in Ethiopia. Okay, next question. Which of these statements are true? Climate change has caused human brains to increase in size. The increase in size of human brain is actually associated with an increase in global temperature. Human brain size has caused rise and an increase in the climate fluctuations, or all of the above. Which of these is correct? So, has climate change caused human brains to increase in size, or is it that the increase in size of the humans is actually associated with an increase in global temperature, or do human brain sizes cause rise in the human in climate fluctuations? So, the correct answer is that the increase in the size of the human brain is actually associated in some sense with the increase in the global temperature. That is what the trends showed. Identify the false statement. Neanderthals endowed us with genes that cause addiction to tobacco and depression. Denisovans are another type of humans that existed around Siberia nearly 30,000 years ago. Swante Pavu received the Nobel Prize for decoding the Neanderthal genome. Due to interbreeding of humans with Neanderthals, we have a weaker immune system. So identify the false statement. Which of these is incorrect? Yeah, and so the incorrect statement is actually that due to the interbreeding of humans with Neanderthals, we have a weaker immune system because we actually have a stronger immune system because of interbreeding with Neanderthals. Last question for today is that divergent evolution leads to what? Does it lead to species developing similar traits despite being different ancestors? Does it lead to accumulation of differences leading to new species? Is it populations losing genetic diversity due to chance, or is it traits disappearing completely from all individuals? So, as you might have already guessed, the correct answer is the accumulation of differences, which leads to new species. Okay, this was all for today. Thank you for joining. And if you have any doubts, you can type them out in the comment section, and I will go through them and try and answer your doubts. Thank you.